Hello, welcome to Foreign Entanglements. I'm Matt Duss. I'm a foreign policy analyst at the Center for American Progress. Happy to welcome today, for the first time, I believe, on Blogging Heads, Michael Singh, who's with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Michael, welcome.
Thanks, Matt. Good to be here.
Michael, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. As you said, I'm the managing director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. We're a nonpartisan think tank here in Washington, which focuses just on U.S. policy in the Middle East. Before I came to the Washington Institute, I was senior director for the Middle East at the National Security Council. And before I was senior director for the Middle East, I worked specifically on Iran issues at the National Security Council. And several years in government before that, also working on Middle East issues.
Well, great. Really glad you could join me today. Let's start off with a piece you published yesterday in the Washington Post, an op-ed, looking forward to the P5+1 and Iran talks on Iran's nuclear program scheduled for this Friday to begin. Why don't you just tell us about what you were arguing in that piece, and then we can go from there.
Sure. Well, I'm a veteran of several rounds of this P5+1 process. This began essentially now almost 8 years ago, and the United States has been involved ever since the beginning of the P5+1 negotiations with Iran, and in August 2008, for the first time, sent a representative to those talks. Before we had refused to send a representative to the talks until Iran suspended uranium enrichment. And, I know from my involvement in the talks that we only have so many sort of moments of leverage with the Iranians in the Middle East. And to me, this is a moment of leverage, and why? Because of two things primarily. One is what I think most people think of as a credible and increasingly imminent threat of an Israeli military strike on Iran. The Israelis have made it quite clear that they think that they're reaching the point now where they have to seriously consider a military strike. And regardless of what the Iranians say, regardless of their sort of rhetoric to the contrary, I think the Iranians must worry about that possibility. And second, the second point of leverage is the tremendous pressure via sanctions that the Iranian regime is now under. Those of us who've been working this Iran file, Matt, as you know very well, have often said that really the Achilles heel of this regime is its dependence on oil exports to fund the government, to fund everything it does, to ensure domestic stability as well. And those oil exports are now under tremendous pressure. The U.S. Department of Energy, I think, said yesterday or today that Iran's oil exports could decline precipitously, in 2012. And so this is a tremendous amount of pressure now that the Iranian regime is under. And it gives us leverage going into these talks because I'm sure the regime, all things being equal, would like to see these pressures relieved. And my essential argument is we need to not squander, not waste this leverage by coming in with a sort of minimalist offer that's aimed not at fundamentally addressing our concerns about Iran's nuclear program, but merely at somehow sort of, in the near term, delaying an Israeli military action, which U.S. officials have very publicly and very sort of nervously displayed their worries about. I think we do need to use this leverage to bring Iran's nuclear program essentially to a halt, to get them to suspend enrichment, to get them to submit to intrusive monitoring and verification, to suspend reprocessing, basically all those things which are in fact called for in the UN Security Council resolutions. And for us now to sort of start moving our red lines back from what's called for in those Security Council resolutions, to me seems, not smart, but also unnecessary.
So, the issue I have with, I think the idea about squandering leverage is interesting, but the issue I really have is that I just don't think it's feasible at all at this point to ask the Iranians to completely halt enrichment. And I think we're looking at a situation right now where we're not going to solve the whole problem in a day of talks. We're not going to solve the whole problem in 2 days or a week. It seems like the very best we can hope for out of Friday's talks is a smaller agreement of precisely the sort that you seem to dismiss and reject. it seems to me that squandering leverage, I mean, a good way to squander leverage would be to go in and ask for the whole enchilada and get nothing. You see what I'm saying?
I see your point, Matt. I guess my my response to that would be that I think that the idea of asking the Iranian regime to suspend enrichment is, to me, the wrong way to think about it. I think you have to present them with a choice, and they need to clearly understand that choice. And the choice is either the pressure gets worse, or they suspend enrichment. And so it's not as though we're making a request of them to do something that's, clearly very hard for them to do. It's that we're presenting them with that choice, which is clearly hard, and an even worse choice on the other hand. And I think that requires a certain toughness in the negotiations, which may be uncomfortable and may be difficult, but I think is necessary. To me, the question is, I'd be more than happy with the position that, okay, let's just go for limited enrichment because it's what they're more likely to agree for. If I felt that was a sensible or sort of useful position for us to be in, my worry is that, what I think the Iranians really want out of these talks is not some grand accommodation with the United States and the P5+1. It's certainly not to sacrifice their nuclear program, which is quite important to them. I think what they want is relief from pressure. Yeah. That seems likely to be the reason they've even agreed to come to the talks in the first place. And I think we need to, in return for that relief from pressure, I think we need to make sure that we drive quite a tough bargain. I think if we leave them with an enrichment capability during some kind of negotiating process, that would be a mistake. I mean, first of all, it allows them then to sort of drag out the talks basically as long as they want, sort of all the while enriching uranium. And the key obstacle for the Iranians right now, is not enriching from 20% to 95%, not doing those things. The key obstacle is, in fact, the sort of technical mastery, the sort of the competence when it comes to operating centrifuges. And so every day that we allow them to enrich, even to 3.5%, they're perfecting those capabilities. And when the talks end or when they call off the talks, they'll be that much further along in terms of their mastery of the process. And I think that we can't afford to allow them to use talks for that.
Well, they're doing that whether or not we talk, right? If we don't talk, they're enriching and getting better at it. And if we do talk, they're enriching and getting better at it, correct?
Well, you're absolutely right.
Right, so I'm not, I mean, I actually want I would love to hear your thoughts on this, because I do hear this argument made quite a bit, is that, they're using these talks as, to just waste time, or, to buy time so they can continue to enrich, yet they're doing that regardless of whether we talk or not. So, just kind of draw out that argument a little bit for me.
Well, I think you're right. So, I mean, if the Iranians come in and say no, we're not going to suspend enrichment, they'll continue enriching. You're right, but we'll still be adding pressure. So they'll need to do that in an environment where they're under oil export sanctions, they're under increasing pressure, and there's a substantial cost to them for making that decision, which should theoretically deter them from making that decision if they're rational, if they're making a cost-benefit analysis. If instead we come to them and say, look, if you just kind of scale back that enrichment, but you can continue it at 3.5 or 5%, we'll relieve some of that pressure, or we'll not add more pressure. Well, that's a very easy thing for them to do. So the question is, well, if you believe they're going to continue enriching anyway, well, then if you take off the pressure, then they have no incentive to ever stop enriching. Whereas if you add to the pressure, well, maybe these talks fail, but maybe a month down the road, 2 months down the road, they reach a different conclusion, and they do stop the enrichment because of that added pressure. So I would say just don't give them the easy way out. If you give them the easy way out, of course, they'll take it. And the benefits to us, in my mind, are difficult to identify, except for some hope that this will lead down the road to some sort of grand agreement with the Iranians, which to me is unlikely to materialize, especially in an environment where we've essentially allowed them to continue with their nuclear program without a great deal of cost or payment on their part.
I think that's all right. I mean, I guess I would quibble a bit on the amount of pressure we've brought. I think it may not, it's clearly not yet decisive, but I think there's a significant amount of pressure that has been brought over the last few years. But And I agree with you. I think a grand bargain at this point, it's kind of like this holy grail of U.S.-Iran engagement. I think that I'm very, very skeptical that that's in the cards. I think what I'm hoping for, and I think perhaps you agree, is, a step that leads to, a grand bargain on the nuclear program, not a grand bargain on U.S.-Iran relations writ large. But getting back to your point about offering Iran a choice, I think I agree with that framing, but it seems that there's a huge space between giving away the store to Iran and demanding Iran's complete capitulation on its nuclear program. Now, I agree that we need to offer the Iranians a choice, but I think if the choice is surrender completely, capitulate to these demands, or more pressure, it doesn't seem a very hard sell for Iranians, both within the regime and to their own supporters in the country, shrinking as that number of supporters may be, to say the West simply wanted us to surrender our nuclear rights, and we couldn't do that. I think it seems wiser to me to offer, to try to achieve a deal, even if it's not everything we want right now, offering a deal that allows Iran to plausibly, present as a win for its own side, and B, is extremely difficult to justify refusing. You see what I'm saying?
Sure, and I think that we have to keep in mind, though, Matt. I guess and I know that this is what you have in mind, that a deal is not really what we're after here. We're not interested in the deal just for the sake of reaching a deal. We have to reach a deal which satisfies our national security interests.
Right.
And it's true that there's a narrative out there which is propagated by the Iranian regime that somehow suspending enrichment is equal to surrender. But I don't think we can define the problem or we can define the process in terms of the regime's narrative. Because that narrative is frankly very convenient for them, because it basically says, any compromise by them is impossible. The compromise has to come from our side.
Right.
Because of the conditions they've set. The fact is, Matt, as you know very well, there are very few countries in the world that have uranium enrichment programs. So it's not as though Iran would suddenly not have something that every other country has. What we'd be asking them to do is, in fact, eminently reasonable. It's codified in multiple UN Security Council resolutions, most of which enjoyed unanimous support. And frankly, is not a practically difficult step for the Iranians to take. They have plenty of LEU stockpiles. They've enriched this. They've made this 19.75% LEU as well. They have no actual use for it. They certainly don't need more right now. So the only obstacle, essentially, for the Iranians is that they don't want to do it, or that they've painted themselves into a corner where it may be rhetorically difficult for them to justify without appearing weak in front of their people. That, frankly, is a problem they've created for themselves. Now, could we sort of try to word things in a certain way to help them out of it? Perhaps, but I see that, frankly, as their problem. They've got to figure out a way to, if they really want to relieve the pressure, if they really want to get out of this bind that they're in, and I think it's quite a serious bind, then they've got to figure that out. But we do need to keep in mind that from an objective basis, this is not a difficult requirement that we're asking the Iranians. And frankly, we have to keep in mind as well the context here, which is this is a regime which has built all of its nuclear facilities clandestinely and in violation of its international obligations, whether it's Natanz, Iraq, Qom. All of these things were done without the transparency that, frankly, is required under the NPT. So to talk about their nuclear rights, frankly, to me is just a diversion and sort of illegitimate, and I don't want to buy into that narrative.
No, I think you make some very good points in terms of the international legality and the pretty strong consensus that they are outside. They violated their own commitments under the NPT. What's required under multiple UN Security Council resolutions. I think that's all correct. But I think from a practical standpoint, if the goal is what's good for U.S. national security, and of course it should be, achieving a deal that even if it doesn't get all of our demands met right at the outset, but leads to doing that eventually, an Iranian nuclear program that is fully in compliance with the NPT and all of the IAEA's questions answered and the additional protocol implemented, etc., getting that is the goal. I think you agree. But in getting there, even though we don't want to simply buy into the Iranian government's own narrative about what's going on here, that narrative and the politics that narrative is meant to work within and affect does matter. So it's not a question of simply adopting their narrative. It's recognizing that we need to help develop we need to come to a deal that they can plausibly, that they can sell to themselves and sell to their people. I think there's a difference there in what we're both saying. You see what I mean?
No, I think there is a difference, and I do understand what you're saying, and I acknowledge that at this point the regime has created conditions for itself which frankly make any compromise difficult. I guess my own interpretation of that would be that frankly the Supreme Leader is not really interested in compromise with the United States, and in fact it's not just for him rhetoric. I think he does see compromise with the United States as something that would be dangerous to his regime. I think that when it comes down to it, if you look at the previous instances, Matt, where the Iranians did make major strategic shifts or major compromises, you look at, for example, 2003, when the Iranians suspended enrichment, where they suspended apparently their weaponization research for some time, and they started a negotiation process with the EU3, one that ultimately didn't pan out. It was under tremendous pressure, and it was essentially for them, a unilateral shift as a result of pressure. It didn't come as a result of outreach. It didn't come as a result of a process. It came as a result of the pressure. The same is probably true at the end of the Iran-Iraq War, when it was multiple envoys who had gone to the Iranians to try to convince the Supreme Leader there to accept a ceasefire with Iraq, failed, essentially. And it was only after a tremendous amount of military pressure was brought to bear on the Iranians that the Supreme Leader made essentially a unilateral decision to change course, despite having said multiple times before that it was a religious obligation to continue with the Iran-Iraq War. Right. So, I personally question, whether, again, maybe this is based in part on my own experience of this process. We tried the freeze for freeze, we've tried multiple face-saving offers, and generally, again, what we found is the Iranians will simply use these things to buy time and then make advances in their nuclear program. To me, I think that the test is there enough pressure to get the Iranians to want to change course? If they want to change course, if they've decided that this is in their interests, I think they'll find the rationale, they'll find the justification. I think for us to try to manufacture that for them is mistaken. We don't, frankly, know their system or know their politics nearly well enough to understand what kind of narrative or what kind of justification they feel they need to create for their people. I think what we do understand is the sort of the different interests at play here, and if I think we make them feel as though their interests demand a change, then they'll figure out how to make that change.
So looking back at the elections, Khamenei's close, parties close to him, conservatives and even ultra-conservatives, did very well. Ahmadinejad's faction was pretty severely diminished. And the Supreme Leader once again sort of reasserted his control, his unquestioned authority, if it was ever really in question, over the Iranian system. What implications do you think that might have for the talks?
That's a great question and a difficult one. The Kremlinology here is quite hard, frankly, because my own view of this is that what we've seen in the Iranian regime, not just in these last elections, but as a pattern over the past several years, beginning perhaps with the initial election in 2005 with Ahmadinejad, has been a real narrowing of this regime. So instead of having reformists inside the regime, traditional conservatives inside the regime, you really see a regime now which is composed almost exclusively of hardliners. One Iranian American commentator said to me recently that now you have the radical camp and the very radical camp, which are in power in Tehran and competing with one another. And that seems to suggest to me that what you don't have around the Supreme Leader, what you don't have inside the government, are voices of reason, people who might have an alternative view of relations with the United States or of the nuclear issue. That frankly you might have had with the reformists, even though the reformists under President Khatami weren't able to get much done on these issues. If you're looking for a glimmer of hope, you could probably find it in the fact that the Supreme Leader chose to retain former President Rafsanjani as head of the Expediency Council. Rafsanjani is someone who has been a little bit more outspoken about better relations with the United States. And so, again, if you're looking for a glimmer of hope that perhaps the Supreme Leader is trying to keep his options open, it's there. But, again, I think the Kremlinology here is quite hard. To me, it points in a negative direction. And at the end of the day, we'll have to judge based on actions more than anything else. And so that's, again, why these April 13th talks are so important.
Speaking of Rafsanjani, I mean, he gave an interview last week, which I'm sure you read, which, he talked about his past support for engagement with the United States. He also made a clarification about statements of his from the 1990s in which he talked about Israel being particularly vulnerable to a nuclear exchange. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Now, it was an interesting clarification because he seemed, as I'm sure he is aware of how often that speech had been cited by people who are more hawkish on this issue in the West and in particular in the United States and Israel, interpreting his statement as saying, in a nuclear exchange it will take only one nuclear weapon to completely destroy Israel. And he clarified that to say, his point was not that we Muslims can survive a nuclear exchange while Israel can't. It was to say that in a nuclear-free Middle East is in everyone's best interest because a Middle East full of nuclear weapons makes Israel particularly vulnerable. Now, without getting into the reasons for why he said that, it does seem pretty interesting in light of a number of other statements. We had Mohammad Javad Larijani talking to Christiana Amanpour a couple weeks ago, specifically disavowing Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's statements about wiping Israel off the map. Larijani told her that this was not a policy of Iran. It was not meant in a military sense. And then we had Khamenei himself, the Supreme Leader, before that, reiterating his statement about nuclear weapons being un-Islamic. Now, taken together, it does seem, first of all, these are just statements. But it does seem that these are, pretty key Iranian spokespersons walking back points of particular concern to the West. And taken together, I think you have to see it as somewhat positive. Or I guess you could also see it as just trying to play for time and lower the temperature if they want to just, keep enriching as you suggested. What's your take on it?
Well, it's all very interesting. None of this is going to, of course, convince the United States or Israel or anyone else, for that matter, that Iran could be trusted with a nuclear weapon, much less a nuclear weapons capability. That is based less on one statement or two statements and more on just an understanding not only of the Iranian regime but of the regional dynamics in the Middle East. I think, though, look, this sanctions and pressure policy, as well as the outreach side of international policy towards Iran, is designed to get Iranian elites, to get Iranian officials to rethink their approach to the world, to rethink their approach to the United States, to Israel, to the West in general, and to convince them, essentially, that their interests lie not with hostility and confrontation, and in particular not with pursuing a nuclear weapon, but their interests lie instead with cooperation with the West. And so, you could, if you wanted to, take these as signs that perhaps that's working, that perhaps there are people questioning inside Iran now whether, in fact, their policies have been wise, for Iranian interests. That's, of course, the effect we want to create. We of course, again, Iran is no big place. We don't know that that's what's happening here. This could, as you said, just be an attempt to distract or delay or kind of forestall tougher sanctions or military action, for that matter. But it could also represent some genuine debate inside the Iranian elites, and that would be a positive thing from my point of view. Rafsanjani, as you know very well, Matt, is a guy who I think has always had a slightly different take on the path Iran should take. If anything, I think he's had in mind as a model for Iran something more like China, where Iran would open, at least economically, to the rest of the world while not reforming politically. I don't think that's necessarily the model that we support for Iran, but it's certainly a more sensible approach in my mind for the Iranians to take than the one they're taking now, which is essentially just to be closed off from the world.
So, going back to the talks this Friday, say the talks just break down as the Istanbul talks did over a year ago, nothing achieved, no progress. What's the next step?
Well, clearly, the Obama administration and the P5+1 allies are going to be very disappointed if that happens, and they'll have to come together and they'll have to talk and see if they can't reach some kind of consensus on where to go next. This won't be easy because we're in a phase now where any of the next steps are difficult steps. There are no more easy options left in this. My guess is that if the talks fail, there'll be a lot of support for further sanctions in the EU and in the United States. And probably what you'll see immediately would be further EU sanctions. You would see further U.S. national sanctions. But what's not clear to me is whether you would see anything broader than that, whether we'll have another UN Security Council resolution that's meaningful, for example, because it's just not clear to me the Russians and Chinese ultimately are willing to do that. You may also see, frankly, an Israeli military action. I think that is becoming more and more possible as this issue looks less and less likely to be resolved using the strategy that the P5+1 have applied for the last 8 or 9 years. So sanctions, maybe military action, I think are what's in store if these talks are a failure.
So what further sanctions are there really? I mean, I think you just said, China and Russia have sort of reached their limit in terms of what they're willing to do. I mean, at what point do we sort of reach that, that Iraq point where we've just completely got them under just a set of crushing sanctions, and then it becomes a question of how long politically we can sustain a coalition to maintain those sanctions?
Well, I think you're right to point out that problem, the sustainability of a sanctions regime. I mean, certainly these things do tend to deteriorate over time, and that's something which again adds urgency, I think, to resolving the issue, and will be something we have to think about down the road if this diplomacy doesn't work out. I think though that we're not nearly there yet in terms of the comparison to Iraq, for example, because right now you don't have comprehensive sanctions, for example, on Iran's hydrocarbon sector, on its oil exports, for example. And I would expect to see the U.S. Congress, as it is right now, trying to tighten up our own sanctions, as well as a diplomatic effort to get others to tighten their sanctions. For the EU, one thing that they've talked about, for example, that you've seen media reports on, would be sanctions on insurance. The Europeans have not quite a monopoly, but almost a monopoly on the global reinsurance market. And so that's a potential line for them to take, which would make life even more difficult for the Iranians. And then, there is this question of, if there is no diplomatic solution here, if the talks don't pan out, and I don't think we can by any means reach that conclusion yet. It may just be that the Iranian threshold for this pressure is higher than the threshold we're at now, but that if further pressure is placed, that they'll be more willing to suspend enrichment to do the things we want them to do. But if that's not the case, then we'll be faced with either trying to keep the sanctions regime in place for quite some time to further delay their nuclear program, or at some point we'll face the question about military action. I think, again, we're not there yet. There's still room for more sanctions. There's room for more diplomacy. But certainly, as President Obama has said, as other leaders have said, that window seems to be closing, and one questions how much time is really left here.
So, what do you think the minimum? I mean, I think you clearly, as we discussed before, and you wrote in your op-ed, what we should, you suggested what we should ask for, or what we should demand, or what we should require of the Iranians in this. I mean, and I explained why I disagreed, and I thought that, we should go for, just for now, what is, ask for more than what is possible, be willing to accept a little bit less than that. What's the minimum, do you think, that the P5+1 would be willing to accept out of these talks, in the hope of getting more further down the road?
Well, I think that basically the realization I think we need to have is that the talks may take a long time, and because they may take a long time, if in fact there is a real negotiating process, the key thing is ensuring that Iran can't use that time to advance its nuclear program. And that, I think, leads to several conditions which we have to hold quite firm to. One is suspension of enrichment, as I talked about before. The second is, I do think those existing stockpiles of enriched uranium will need to be moved out of the country, so that if, in fact, there's a covert enrichment plant that we're not aware of, that can't be used to develop weapons-grade fuel. And then I think there would need to be intrusive inspections, monitoring and verification of the sort that comes with the additional protocol, with Code 3.1 of Iran's subsidiary arrangements with the IAEA. I think those are essentially the key things. There's, of course, many more things. There's many more details. There's reprocessing and so forth as well, which I expect would be covered as well. But those are the key things to ensure that Iran's nuclear program does not advance during the period of negotiations. I think if Iran is willing to do those things, that opens up the space for talks. And where those talks go then is a separate question. But I think that's what's necessary to create the conditions for them.
Well, see, there, I mean, the question of, okay, the program should not advance. If we come to a deal on 20% enrichment, they stop doing it, we come up with some formula where we get that more highly enriched, that 20% enriched uranium out of the country, you've essentially lengthened the timeline, within which Iran could plausibly produce a weapon, or reach breakout capacity. You've lengthened that timeline. So effectively, that's helping Iran's nuclear program not advance. Do you agree?
No, I don't really agree with that, and it gets into a little bit of a technical issue, because, it depends what you consider advancement. It depends what you consider sort of to be the key factors in determining their nuclear breakout timeline. Mm-hmm. To me, the difference between 5% and 19.75% enrichment on a technical basis is not that great. What most nuclear physicists would tell you, nuclear technicians would tell you, is that 95% of the work is getting to the 3.5 or 5% level. And then going beyond that, even to weapons grade, is actually a much simpler task. Mm-hmm. And to me, the real challenge the Iranians have, again, is the engineering challenge. It's just the expertise in installing and maintaining and running the centrifuges. And so actually the extra sort of 15% or so is less important to them than simply being able to continue running those centrifuge plants, in my mind. And so actually, I care a lot less about that 20% than I do about the suspension of enrichment when it comes to determining whether their program's advancing and what their timelines are going to be ultimately. People may disagree with that on a technical basis, but that essentially, to me, is how I see it.
Mm-hmm. So, looking down the road, I mean, some of the consequences of the talks not achieving anything, failing, what have you, a possible strike by Israel, but then the question of, say we have a nuclear-capable Iran. I mean, one thing I wanted to talk about was this idea of a wave of proliferation in the Middle East, which is often brought out as a very real possible consequence of a nuclear-capable Iran or of an Iranian nuclear weapon. And I wanted to mention a piece by Steve Cook in Foreign Policy magazine last week that really questioned some of those assumptions, particularly in regard to Turkey getting a nuclear weapon and Saudi Arabia getting a nuclear weapon. And he just, he's very, very skeptical for different reasons. First of all, Turkey remaining, as a member of NATO under the U.S. security umbrella, and Saudi Arabia, for different reasons, just, different Saudi spokesmen have said, if Iran got a nuclear weapon, we'd have to get one, and there's the idea that they could just buy the equipment and buy the technology from Pakistan or from wherever, but yet they have no nuclear infrastructure to run this stuff, to develop it. They could buy it in who knows how long, but we're talking about a fairly long process. So it was essentially an attempt to sort of tamp down that argument as a consequence. Are you familiar with the piece?
Yep.
What did you think of it?
Questioning assumptions is a good thing, and I'm a big supporter of that, because I think that we can get locked in to sort of our assumptions here in Washington, especially. And I respect Steve, but I strongly disagree with his piece. For a few reasons. I mean, one, before we even talk about the proliferation of nuclear weapons, let's talk about the proliferation of nuclear technology. The United States, as you know, Matt, has been pursuing what we call 1, 2, 3 agreements with different countries in the region, which essentially is an agreement to provide civilian nuclear assistance, nuclear reactors and things like that to countries. And what both the Bush and Obama administrations have tried to do is to basically insist that in exchange for American assistance on the sort of technology of nuclear power, that these countries forego enrichment of uranium, because the enrichment of uranium is something we're not just concerned about in the Iranian context, but we're concerned about in the global context as we try to tighten up the global non-proliferation regime. Well, if we're in an environment where we've acquiesced or even permitted by agreement the Iranians to enrich uranium, it puts us in a very difficult position with countries like, say, Jordan or the UAE to go and say to them, well, but you can't do this. In any case, I don't think they would accept that. I'm not sure they accept it now, and I certainly don't think they would accept it then. So you'd have the proliferation first of the technology, which is proliferation sensitive. And that gets into questions of nuclear controls, making sure we can keep track of all the different stockpiles of enriched uranium that are in the world, which is already a difficult question, and frankly, one which is very hard to address. I don't think we should want to do anything that makes that question more difficult or makes nuclear materials more easily available in the world. There's also a question of what Iran would do. Every country that's ever had nuclear weapons has shared nuclear weapons technology with others. And so would Iran be the sole exception to this rule? I think we have good reason to doubt that. And so then the question is, who would Iran share the technology with? Would they share it with other countries? Would they share it with non-state actors, like Hezbollah, with whom they share most of their quite sensitive military technology?
Well, they hold back a lot from Hezbollah, though. I mean, yes, they give them a lot of weapons, but they do hold back a lot of high levels.
So be that as it may, as I said, every country, including Western countries, which have had nuclear technology, weapons technology, have shared it. And again, so you'd have to believe that Iran would be the exception to that rule to think that it wouldn't spread from Iran to other places. And there are certainly other countries in the world who might be interested in this. There are other countries in the world who have sort of political ties with Iran who might be interested in being the beneficiaries of such sharing. And then you can take into account the question of what would Iran's foes in the region do, those who consider Iran to be their primary threat, which includes all the GCC countries. It certainly includes Turkey. It includes countries which are more far-flung. Now, these countries, most of them are quite wealthy. They would have a strong motivation. And with the means and the motivation, you'd have to believe that they just wouldn't be able to get their hands on the technology. Now, whatever the current state of their nuclear programs, I just have a hard time believing that. Countries like Pakistan, like North Korea, have gotten their hands on nuclear weapons technology. These are not necessarily very prosperous or very advanced countries. And so to assume that Turkey couldn't do it, to assume that Saudi Arabia couldn't do it, to me is just too far-fetched and too much wishful thinking. Could they do it next year? Could they do it in 2 years? I don't think we have to believe that eventually, with the means and motivation, they would do it.
So this point about weapons versus technology, I think, is an interesting one, and I mean brings me to the last point I wanted to discuss before we finish up. Was a few weeks ago around the conference of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, Israeli Mr. Netanyahu came to town, and he and President Obama had a meeting in the White House, and they both gave speeches to the conference, and the talk was all around, will Israel succeed? Will Netanyahu succeed in bringing the president closer to his position on Iran? And it seemed that the disagreement really came down to the Israelis' position that they cannot countenance an Iranian nuclear weapons capability, and the president, kept his red line, America's red line, at an Iranian nuclear weapon. Now, what do you make of that distinction?
Yeah, sorry about the coughing, Matt.
That's okay.
I think that The U.S. red line right now is not clear. What the president has said, what Secretary of Defense Panetta has said, is that our red line is that Iran not get a nuclear weapon. Now, that would seem to suggest in theory that we'd allow Iran, or we'd permit Iran to do lots of things up to having a nuclear weapon, perhaps even having what you and I and others in the field might call latency, have all the components of a nuclear weapon without actually assembling or testing a nuclear weapon. To me, that's not an acceptable position to be in, and I think it's certainly not acceptable for the Israelis, because the question is, would you have visibility? Would you have the ability to detect a move to actually then make a nuclear weapon? Could you do anything about it even if you knew that it was happening? And so I think what the Israelis seem to have in mind, although again this is not never entirely clear, is what is the last point at which we'll have clear visibility and the ability to stop a movement towards a nuclear weapon. And so wherever you fix that point, I think the Israelis have called this the zone of immunity. Wherever you fix that point would be the point at which you'd want to ensure the Iranians stopped. To me, it's in many ways a moot point, because allowing the Iranians to get a screwdriver's turn away from a nuclear weapon is essentially as good as letting them have a nuclear weapon. And I worry not just about the Iranians actually having a nuclear weapon. I worry about the proliferation of this technology, weapons technology, around the world in the global non-proliferation regime. And so, to me, for our interests, for our national security interests, especially once we broaden our scope beyond just Iran and look at our global security interests, what we really should aim for is rolling back this program and getting to a point where Iran doesn't have this weapon-sensitive technology at all. That, I think, is what our goal should be. We shouldn't set the bar so low as to say, well, as long as they don't have nuclear weapons, we're fine with them having everything up to that. To me, that's just not responsible.
So, I mean, it comes down to, well, how long and how noticeable is that last turn of the screwdriver?
It's a question, but to me, that's only one of many problems that we would have. Is whether we could detect and then stop them at that point.
So, I mean, we come now to the question that, these sorts of discussions, I'm sure, as you've had them and as I've had them, comes down to, is what level of risk at what time are we willing to accept about what to do about Iran's nuclear program? There's a certain level of risks and very likely consequences of either Israeli or U.S. strikes on Iran's nuclear program. There's a certain level of risk and potential consequences of an Iranian nuclear capability. It's not something we're going to solve here, but I don't think I'm giving anything away by, in our previous discussions. I think you come down that the risks of an Iranian nuclear capability outweigh those of strikes to set back Iran's nuclear program.
That's right. I would come down on that side. I certainly don't favor war. War is always risky and it always comes with uncertainty. But if we weigh the risks that would come with a military strike against the risks of Iran having a nuclear weapon, and if we also weigh the duration of those sort of two crises, I think, to me, we come down clearly on the side of preferring a military strike to a nuclear-armed Iran. And, of course, that's also the position that President Obama has come to. It's the position that President Bush came to. It's the position the Israelis came to. And it's certainly the position that our allies in the Middle East have. And so I think this is, at least in policy terms, not a terribly controversial position, although it is something that is still debated in scholarly circles, for example. We shouldn't want to leave ourselves with just those two choices, Matt, is I guess where I would say we should be right now, which is we want this campaign of pressure and diplomacy to work so that we're not left with that very unpalatable binary choice. That's what I'm focused on right now, and I think that's where all of us should be focused right now.
Right. I guess I would push back on the idea that it's not controversial in the security establishment. I think it's quite controversial. We've got a number of military leaders, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, making very clear that the consequences of a strike are considerable. Also in terms of Arab allies, I think it's fair to say that the Arab leaders, many of them authoritarian leaders who were partners with, kind of support America taking care of their problems once again. But there was a recent poll that took place of the Arab publics, and there's simply no question. I mean, the Arab publics, Arab people themselves, are overwhelmingly opposed to either a U.S. or Israeli strike on Iran, and they're not concerned nearly at all. I think 5% of this poll saw an Iranian nuclear weapon as a top threat. So I think we do need to distinguish about who we're talking to when we refer to our Arab allies.
Well, when it comes down to the question of military conflict, I think it's often very important in terms of how you frame it. If you ask a military leader or someone else whether they want a military conflict or whether a military conflict would be easy or whether it would be risky, of course a military conflict would have risks and consequences. And I don't think, it would be irresponsible of us to dismiss those. But again, you have to weigh it against the alternative. And I think when you weigh it against the alternative, if you ask those military leaders, would you prefer military conflict or living with an Iranian nuclear weapon? To me, again, I think the consensus comes down on using a military strike. As far as the public opinion goes, I'm not sure that even in, for example, Iran, there's really adequate debate in many of these countries or adequate information about this issue. In Iran itself, for example, we talk about, the Iranian people are behind the nuclear program. But in fact, there's no real forum for them to debate this issue, an issue which is so consequential to their future, to the future of their country, is not something that they are able to freely discuss. I think in a way that reflects all the different pros and cons of the situation. And I think, frankly, that for example, if you look at the American people and the polls that are done in the United States, if you ask people what approach should we take to this issue, people have a clear preference for sanctions, for diplomacy, for measures short of military conflict. But if you then ask them, well, if all those things fail to work, would you support a military strike, or would you support the idea of containment of a nuclear-armed Iran? The majority tends to be on the side of a military strike, and to me, that's a wise course. That's the public opinion there reflects, I think, what a wise course looks like, which is you try all these other measures, but at the end of the day, you recognize that the danger of a nuclear-armed Iran is too great to live with.
Right. No, I think it's a great point about polling in Iran. I think there was a lot of controversy about some of the polling that was done in the wake of the 2009 presidential election. And obviously, for a number of reasons, in an authoritarian state like Iran, it's very difficult, to get dependable polling numbers on what people think. I think we can sort of triangulate and read, try our best to read some of the signals from the Iranian system and end up with a conclusion that many Iranians do see, if not specifically a nuclear weapon, but the ability to have a nuclear program and enrich and master the fuel cycle as something of a port of nationalist pride, but I don't think that's decisive. I mean, I think there are real questions as to what Iranians would be willing to give up if it meant lessening Iranian isolation and greater interaction and engagement with the international community. But anyway, I think we've come to the end of the discussion. Mike, I really appreciate your time. It was very interesting. Thanks for being here.
Thanks a lot, and likewise, Matt. I appreciate the chance to have this conversation with you.
All right, and thanks everyone, and do visit our Foreign Entanglements Facebook page, and we'll see you next time.